Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Off-Farm Income Podcast. Hey, thank you so much for joining us here on our YouTube channel for episode number 969. Well, I got to tell you, I am always looking for that key or that missing piece of that puzzle to help people who want to farm figure out how they're actually going to make it happen. Well, I've got an exciting interview today for you with a gentleman named Stacy Funderburke, coming to us from the Conservation Fund. He's going to be talking to us about a pilot program that they are rolling out in the metro area of Atlanta, Georgia, to preserve farm ground and at the same time give new and beginning farmers a really good shot at getting started in farming and helping them to overcome a lot of those obstacles that come with a new and beginning farm operation, like equipment costs, like land costs, and things like that. It's a very, very exciting program. It's going to be really interesting for you to hear about, and I'm very excited to bring it to you. We're going to get that started for you right now. Stacy, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Well, good. It's interesting. Your folks reached out to me a couple weeks ago and said that they'd like to have you on as a guest, and I started researching what you do and what you do at the Conservation Fund, and there was something that really jumped out to me that I wanted to touch on. And so I know that what we're going to talk about today is kind of Atlanta-centric, but it seems to me that this could be a model for other places in the United States. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. And just quick background, the Conservation Fund. I mean, we're a national nonprofit and work around the country, have protected about 8.5 million acres of land. That's everything from city parks to national forests, Park Service lands. But a key focus of the Conservation Fund is both land and water conservation and supporting communities where we work.
Okay.
That leads us to do a lot of working lands protection, and that includes working farmland, working ranches, working forests, because a recognition that if we don't protect those lands and they can't continue to sustain the communities around them, we really will not have achieved our goal at the end of the day. So I've been really excited to launch the Georgia Working Farms Fund program, with the goal to scale that program here around the larger metro Atlanta area and then replicate it in other areas around the country. So I think we have a huge opportunity to do that.
Okay. And I kind of jumped out and got ahead of ourselves, but I want to circle back around to that because I got a bunch of questions about that. Let's take a minute, though, as we begin, just to introduce you. So tell everybody, what is your title, what is your background, all that type of stuff, and then we'll kind of get into the nuts and bolts after that.
Sure. I'm Stacy Funderburke, and I am based in Atlanta, Georgia, work for the Conservation Fund. I wear many hats at the fund. I am a regional counsel and the associate state director for our Georgia and Alabama office. But I am leading the launch of the Georgia Working Farms Fund program here. And I am a native Georgian, grew up in smaller town, Georgia, Milledgeville, but have lived in Atlanta for almost 20 years now.
Okay. All right. Very good. And so you're a practicing attorney, and you just went over to the Conservation Fund, didn't you?
No, I actually have been with the Conservation Fund for almost 13 years now. So yeah, I've had a couple different titles
Okay.
over the years, but I've been with the fund. I was an attorney in Atlanta, worked at a large firm, then worked in-house, but conservation was always something I cared very deeply about. So found my way to the Conservation Fund. It was a good combination.
Okay. I know I had read something about there was a recent announcement, but maybe it's just a title change. Not sure what I had seen. Okay, let's talk about this word conservation at first. So I've got a very, very pro and traditional agricultural audience, and we span the gamut, but we've got a lot of very traditional agricultural people. And conservation's a funny word in kind of the emotional response it can elicit in people. I think back to hunting, and there was a time when if you said the word conservation, hunters would think, oh no, quote unquote, that's the enemy. But now you see hunters and conservationists really working closely together. And sometimes I think agriculture, when you hear the word conservation, you think, oh no, that's the enemy. Tell me why that's different.
Yeah, it's a great point, and this comes up a lot. It actually is one of the first things that comes up in discussions with farmers about our program and the ability to conserve farmland long term. Usually, it's met with immediate concern that this is taking their control away. But the funny part of that is, and I would say this is very analogous to the hunter description that you had. It turns out that farmers are actually among the best stewards of land anywhere in the world because they live on the land. Their
Mm-hmm.
livelihood depends upon it. Caring for it and sustaining it long term is in their best interests, both personally and economically. So when we talk about conservation of farmland, we aren't there's often an idea that that means, oh, if you put a conservation easement on a farm, then you are putting a bubble over it. You can never touch it again. It has to remain exactly as it is today. But that's not the case at all. In fact, conserving farmland is more about keeping it as farmland and keeping a lot of those ecological benefits that are already happening on a day to day basis with the farmers who are caring for that land today, keeping those in place over the long term. And of course, we can get into conservation easements and what those look like. But I find that once that question pops up and we start having a conversation about how those farmers care for their land, what they do in relation to the creek that's on the property and the soil and other things,
Mm-hmm.
that they are actually the best stewards and conservationists of that land. So it's very consistent with what we want to keep going in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because for, well, a few decades now at least, there's been some very significant, I don't know what the right word is. I mean, I think the easy word to come up with is a tax. That might be too strong, but maybe not, on agriculture by environmental groups. And it's going on today. And certainly no industry in America is perfect, including agriculture. But then, of course, the counter to that has always been, look, we're not just stripping the land. I mean, we're not stripping the land bare and moving on to a new patch because that's impossible. There's so many barriers to that. It could never work. We need this piece of land that we're on right now, whether we're running livestock, whether we're raising row crops, whatever it may be. We need this to keep sustaining us and our livelihoods and our households and things like that. So the adage was, why would farmers and ranchers, why would they be destroying the land that they were on, exploiting the land and taking everything and just leaving it worse than they found it? It would just run them out of business. And you're sitting here saying, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's what we're seeing on our end.
Yep, absolutely. And there are distinctions, of course, given depends on the size of the farm and what the
Mm-hmm.
incentives are, right? I mean, there are times that I would say sometimes because of the wrong incentives, do force land beyond its real capacity, right, for
Mm-hmm.
production and things. But in our program, we're really focused on small to mid-sized farms that are anchored around the larger metro Atlanta area. And we're also focused on farmers who really are committed to the long-term sustainability of that farmland. And it is a real ethic that they carry with them on the
Mm-hmm.
land. Some of them are sixth generation farmers, others are folks who are coming into farming for the first time. They've been farming for 5 years, but they don't have access to land. And this is a pathway for them to do that. But it is a very embedded ethic caring for the land and the farmers that we're working with.
Okay. Now, I want to get to the Working Farms Fund here in just a moment, but could you give us an overview, just like a very, very broad overview of everything that the Conservation Fund does?
Sure. A lot of our work is partnering with local, state, and government agencies on land acquisition around the country. So, as I mentioned, I actually do a lot of work inside the city of Atlanta. So, I work
Mm-hmm.
with the Parks Department on land acquisition. We work a lot with the state, new wildlife management areas, new state parks, and we have long-standing partnerships with the Forest Service and the Park Service. So, a lot of that work is those partners telling us what those priority conservation lands are. And we go out and acquire that land and then transfer it to them when the funding is available. So we provide a a really important bridge to getting conservation deals done that wouldn't otherwise happen. So that's
Okay.
how we've added a lot of public land. But there's also a recognition that everything that needs to be protected doesn't need to be and can't be public land, right? At the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a very large working forest fund program that protects larger acreage working forests that will forever stay in private ownership and be managed as forests. But we acquire those forests. We get a conservation easement on them to make
Mm-hmm.
sure they won't be fragmented and broken up and become something else. And then we keep them with that protection in sustainable management over the long term and back in private hands. And you can imagine the same scenario when it comes to working ranches and working farmland, which is important in the
Mm-hmm.
Georgia Working Farms Fund scenario. But we are very sophisticated in real estate acquisition. We know how to go out, negotiate deals, acquire land, and we really make our funds that we use, our revolving fund, to get these deals done go a long way, and the impact goes on and on. So it's been a very successful model over the past 35 years, and we've gotten an amazing amount of conservation done across the country.
Okay. Okay. So before we get too deep into the interview, I think we probably should explain what a conservation easement is and how it works in particular in terms of agriculture. Would you mind doing that?
Sure, happy to. So, conservation easements have been around for a long time, and they're a really important tool, especially when it comes to land conservation in private hands, right? I mean, the conversation we just had about um, everything can become publicly held land and protected in that way. So, conservation easements are a legal tool, and it really is a long term contract. And the funny thing about it is, it's in perpetuity for quite often. There
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you find shorter, but essentially, a conservation easement is an agreement between the existing landowner and a third party, which typically is a local land trust, to take the certain future development rights off of that property. So, in its most basic form, in the agricultural context, it basically means that if we go out and place a conservation easement on a 100-acre farm today, that farmer is committing most typically not to ever fragment that property, break it up, and sell it off for some
Mm-hmm.
other use. And it doesn't mean that they can't farm it. That farming is completely consistent. That's a current use.
Mm-hmm.
It does prohibit development. I mean, that is the
Mm-hmm.
main thing. But you can carve out footprints for future infrastructure that's needed on the farm site. You just have to think through those things on the front end. But a conservation easement is a legally binding document, and that local land trust who holds the easement has the responsibility long term to steward that easement. That means they have to check it every year, make sure that the terms of the easement aren't being violated. And over the long haul, they are also responsible for enforcing the terms of that easement. So if for some reason the farmer was not abiding by the terms of the easement, they
Mm-hmm.
have to enforce that. So there are hundreds of thousands of acres, even protected, with easements, millions across the country.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a really popular tool. And there often are benefits to the landowner by doing that. There are tax incentives for you. You can get a federal tax deduction for taking that value off the land. There are programs at the local, state, and federal level in some places where there is funding for the purchase of a conservation easement, bringing cash directly to that landowner for taking those development rights. And we will get into that in the Working Farms Fund context as well.
Okay. So I want to clarify a couple different pathways here for everybody who's listening. And I'm no expert, so you straighten me out on this. But as I listen to you speak, what I'm hearing is one pathway for a piece of agricultural land to enter into a conservation easement that will guarantee it won't be split up, it won't be developed, it'll continue to be farmed, or at least have the ability to be farmed. That is that the farmer themselves voluntarily enters into this conservation easement. Is that one pathway? Am I understanding that right?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. And I want to expand on that just a little bit to make it clear why this might happen, and then I'll have you give me the rest of the reasons. But where I live in Kuna, Idaho, which is about 15 miles from downtown Boise. And we are sprawling like, well, I mean, we're one of the hottest real estate markets in the entire country. And we are just developing at breakneck speed. For example, one of the ways I'm feeling it is I decided to stop growing my own hay, and now I'm purchasing hay, and I'm using that old hay area as a grazing area for my cattle. And we have less of a supply of hay now because a lot of the hay fields that local farmers around here had been farming on now have houses sitting on top of them. And so that's been going on, and we're experiencing that, at a rapid pace where I live. We've got a school not too far, right in Kuna, Reed Elementary School. And Reed Elementary School at one point was a farm that was owned by the Reed family. And rather than sell the land, rather than, I guess, cash in on that capital investment and over time and the appreciation of that farm ground, they decided they wanted it to go to something different. I guess maybe they didn't need the money. Maybe they wanted to make some sort of a contribution to the community at the end of their farming career. And so they donated that land to the school district, and thus the school was placed on top of it, and it's called Reed Elementary. What we're talking about, where a farmer would voluntarily put their land into a conservation easement, is, in my mind at least, it's kind of the same thing as what the Reeds did, which is we don't have a desire to sell this land and kind of cash out. We want to see this land be used in a certain way, and so we're willing to put it into a conservation easement. And it doesn't mean they can't sell it, but it does mean that the potential buyers for that land have to be somebody who understands they cannot develop it. Am I describing this in a fair way?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if, I mean, you're describing a really good location maybe for a future Working Farms Fund program, because
Yeah.
the things you're describing outside of Boise, and actually I've already have a colleague who's already pointed me towards Boise for this exact reason that you just described. These are very similar to the conditions around Metro Atlanta and what's
Mm-hmm.
happening to a lot of historic farmland and pasture land here.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the reason that a program like the Working Farms Fund is critical to protecting some of that farmland long term. And I think, I mean, if so okay for you, it would probably be a good time to talk a little bit about how the model would work, because I think it will get us into those different options for
Okay.
families that are facing the same kind of development pressure that you just described.
Why don't you just jump right into that?
Sure. The Working Farms Fund is it's a buy, protect, sell model, and they're at the highest level. We're trying to achieve three critical things with the Working Farms Fund in Georgia: protect farmland that is at risk of being lost to development. Major development pressure will come as no surprise.
Mm-hmm.
Atlanta is a poster child for sprawl, and you can just imagine as the metro area grows, that development pressure just gobbles up historic farmland, pasture land as it goes. So land prices are going up, farms are disappearing. Major pressure. The second thing is land access and ultimately land ownership for farmers. And those are sometimes existing farmers in this same area, but it is also a large and expanding group of next generation farmers who are interested in farming land, especially in close proximity to where some of the critical markets are in a place like Atlanta.
Okay.
And the goal is to protect farmland, support those next generation farmers in getting land access, and ultimately owning those farms. And while we're doing this, expanding both the local and sustainable supply to a place like Metro Atlanta. It'll come as a surprise to no one, because this is happening all across the country. You have these major challenges: farmland disappearing at a very rapid rate. Metro Atlanta area has lost 25% of its farms over the past decade.
Mm-hmm.
Very similar to other locations. There are the average age of the farmer in the U.S. is 58 years old and climbing. You see a lot of fourth, fifth. I see this a lot of the area around where I grew up. Fourth and fifth generation farmers who have stewarded that farm, have been successful, but the kids aren't coming back.
Mm-hmm.
They've moved away. They're not interested in the farm for whatever reason. It doesn't make sense, And that farmer does not want to see that become something else, get broken up or
Mm-hmm.
developed to become often a development with farm and name only. But they also can't just sell it at a discount, right, out of nostalgia for the farm that has been there for 5 generations. And so that is a major challenge. Our goal with the Working Farms Fund is to buy farms, small to mid-sized farms that are at risk of being lost in this larger metro Atlanta area.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say metro, I mean 30 counties. So think about rural fringe of
Yeah.
metro. This is not in the city. So let's be clear.
Okay.
These are 20 to 500 acre and 1,000 acre farms. These are
Okay.
not urban farms. Protect farmland that's at risk of being lost to development. As soon as we buy that land, we match a farmer to that site and get them in a position to lease that property with an option to purchase it when they're ready. Typically,
Mm.
that would happen over a 3 to 5 year period. And that is critical because it also allows them to establish themselves on that farm property, get in a better position for the financing they would need for the ultimate purchase of the farm on the back end. And there's a whole suite of support services for that farmer while they're on site, which I'm sure we'll get into. Um, but and then we will work with existing local, state, and federal programs to secure funding to purchase a conservation easement on that property. And that accomplishes a couple key things. One is we're a conservation nonprofit. So when we get that conservation easement on the property, which still allows farming but protects it intact and gives it its best shot at remaining a farm,
Mm-hmm.
um, we're protecting that land forever. But the second thing that happens in an area like this, and it would also be the case in a place around Boise, as you described, is it brings that purchase price of the farm down from development value today
Mm-hmm.
to true farmland value. And in the geography we're talking about here with major development pressure, that is typically 40 to 60% of the overall value of the farm.
Mm-hmm.
So that is really critical because then it makes that farm more affordable
Mm-hmm.
in the ultimate purchase by the farmer and puts them in a much better position to have a successful farm business long term.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I've been trying to solve this puzzle of how somebody who wants to enter into farming can do so with that major obstacle of those land prices existing. And I've chosen, for my method that I teach people about, I've chosen entrepreneurship because what I've been saying for 6 years now is that um, people need to move away from those urban centers to find land where the price of that land reflects its production capability, and there's no competing pressures to buy it, no development pressures or anything like that. But then, of course, when those folks move that far out, they still need a form of off-farm income, and maybe the jobs aren't out there, or maybe the jobs that do exist in that area don't pay what they need. And so that's why I suggest entrepreneurship to try and bridge that gap. And then, of course, there's the other method of farm succession, which is what you're talking about, matching up a new and beginning farmer with a retiring farmer who wants to see the land stay in production. But of course, that doesn't guarantee that that land will stay in production. It just, they're passing it to somebody they trust will continue to farm it. Your method is very interesting because you've got outside dollars coming in, creating a scenario in which a new and beginning farmer, they can lease, but they've got the option. They've got the option to buy after a certain amount of time. But it's this, there's an external support that's helping them to get in there and hopefully lower that median age of farmers. Am I understanding that part right?
Yeah, that's right. And I also, I mean, I love this idea about entrepreneurship because it is a big part of
Mm-hmm.
what we're thinking about and how we support those farmers once they get matched to a Working Farms Fund site. You could imagine a scenario where we go out and run this program and we protect our first 50 farms and the land is protected forever, but we end up with 40 failed farms, right? And the land is under a permanent conservation easement,
Mm-hmm.
but they are not functioning farms. I think we really would have missed our long term goal if that happened. So we have to be thinking about how we can support these farmers in being successful. And so, number one, that is obviously bring down the purchase price of the farm through a program like this and this
Mm-hmm.
buy, protect, sell model. But it is also through the partnerships that we're developing to support those farmers on site. So I would love to talk about that a little bit. But to your other point about finding affordable farmland, Georgia is a great case study in this, right? And I grew up in a more rural part of Georgia. I didn't grow up on a farm, although my grandfather had a couple of, we called them gardens. They were like 2 acre gardens where he grew all of our food. And
Mm-hmm.
I kind of took it for granted that I had access to fresh vegetables my entire life. And so I was lucky to have that. But a lot of the intensive farming and larger scale farming in Georgia is in South Georgia and in largely rural areas that are far removed from some of the larger towns.
Mm-hmm.
And so that opportunity to have, right, different, it could be a family where one person works in the city and a job, support their income, and markets, right? Like those are not accessible in the same way when you are 3 to 4 hours away from a place where a lot of markets are. So
Mm-hmm.
one of the key things about our program is it is intentionally anchored around an area that is a source of both some of those next generation farmers that you described,
Mm-hmm.
but also where a lot of the demand for more local and more sustainable food is. So that is why we have worked really hard. One of the partnerships I'll just hold out as an example that I'm most excited about is we announced a partnership late last year with Emory, which is a university here in the Atlanta area, but they are also a hospital system. So they own, I think it's around 14 or 15 hospitals and manage in the larger metropolitan area. They're the single largest employer in Metro Atlanta.
Well,
And luckily, they have really impressive commitments to sustainability, and that includes sustainable and local sourcing for the food for their students, for their hospital employees and patients. And they have made a very ambitious commitment. And one of their biggest challenges is supply to meet those commitments over
mm-hmm.
time. So we just entered into an MOU, into a partnership with them that will allow every farmer who enters our program
Mm-hmm.
to have the opportunity, it's not the obligation, to contract directly with Emory for the purchase of their food, which means they would have access to a long-term contract for the
Okay.
purchase of a portion of their food. They obviously have to meet those sourcing requirements, which is
Mm-hmm.
another way to incentivize more sustainable practices on site.
Mm-hmm.
But in a place like Atlanta, there is a huge opportunity with institutional buyers like that to create a market and build on. A lot of these are successful farmers already. They're not brand new farmers, but coming to them both with this land access opportunity and new and expanding markets,
Mm-hmm.
as they start to think about wholesale and other things, is a great opportunity, and one that I think we can continue to provide with this program.
Okay. And I want to get into the partnerships that you brought up here in a second, but I've got a couple more clarifying questions for people who are listening. And so you've talked about a couple times that once the land is placed into the conservation easement, it now has taken the potential pool of buyers for that land and it's taken a certain percentage of those buyers and eliminated. Like everybody who's going to develop it, everybody's going to put in a subdivision or whatever
Yeah.
that may be. They are no longer eligible to, well, they're eligible to buy the land, but they have no interest in it because they can't do what they do with this land. And so that lowers the price of the land down to a more reasonable production specific price because development and sprawl is off of the table. Now, I want to take a minute and talk about this because while I don't like the sprawl and I don't like the disappearing farm ground, it's a real paradox because you've got farmers who for 40, 50, 60 years they have poured their blood, sweat, tears, and all of their capital into this piece of land to support their family and to be there and to farm this ground. And their cash out, their retirement, their ability to sustain themselves when they're too old to actually go out and work, go out and farm, is tied up in selling that land and selling that land for its market value. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that and make sure that I'm right, that the conservation fund is not doing anything that prohibits those farmers from selling their land for what it's worth on the free market, including to developers. But you're approaching those farmers, or you're buying those farms at that market value and then converting them into a conservation easement and reducing the value of that. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yep, that's exactly right. And I'll give you a real world example that I think would help flesh it out. They we I was recently on a farm, it's a 50 to 60 acre farm outside of Atlanta, Rockdale County. A couple, both in their 90s.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fifth generation farm, I believe. And the farmer who's there still, still gets out on the tractor, does a little bit of hay, but obviously it's not working farm in the same way that was before. They have three kids, none of whom are interested, or for whatever
Mm-hmm.
reason, they have different professions. They're not coming back to the farm. And I met with a farmer on and his wife on site, and um, they really do not want to see that farm,
Right.
which is loved by them and has been for generation, become something else.
Mm-hmm.
But given development pressure, it is the inheritance for those three children,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
And so they cannot just sell it at half of what it's worth to keep it as a farm. So
Mm-hmm.
they have to have another path to do that. They get approached, I would suspect, weekly by developers who are offering them full market price.
Mm-hmm.
The advantage of our program is no one is forced to enter it. It's just like, but we add another potential seller, and one that, again, we act like any rational buyer, right? We negotiate and try to
Mm-hmm.
get the best price we can, but essentially we are paying full development value, full
Okay.
market price for that property, and offering the long-term option of keeping it as a farm. And not only that, often we're letting that farmer meet the new farmer who
Mm-hmm.
is going to be on that site, and who may learn from them. There's a woman I'm working with who is this amazing cattle farmer, and she has so much knowledge. And every time I go on the farm, I learn something new from her.
Mm-hmm.
She's interested in providing some mentorship as we match. We haven't yet matched the right farmer to her site, but that means a lot to her to know who is going to carry on the legacy of this farm that she's built up over time, and may even will likely buy part of her livestock, to keep it going. And so it is another option for these farmers to get the full value, what they
Mm-hmm.
deserve, and what they built up over time, and what is justifiable given development pressure and everything else, but keep that land as a farm long term.
And that, in and of itself, is the reason why the conservation fund and folks like yourself are necessary, because it's got to start somewhere, where somebody gets people together that wants to see land stay in production, stay as farmland, that are willing to donate money to give you the ability to purchase it at its fair market value, considering development, and then put it in the conservation easement, which will keep it it'll reduce the value of that land on the open market. So that's the purpose of the nonprofit of your organization, is to collect that money to be able to make that initial purchase, to then lock that land up for agriculture, for conservation.
That's right. And just to be clear, this is it's a revolving fund. It's a revolving fund program. So the idea is, we will, and we'll continue. We're still fundraising to build this revolving fund over
Mm-hmm.
time, but we will be able to take those dollars, buy that farm, then leverage. And this is what we do a lot, is work through existing local, state, federal programs that are there to incentivize conservation, right? Because they want to see farmland protected. So working with programs like ASAPL, USDA, and others is is to access those dollars to protect that farmland, which is their purpose, and then have that farmer in a position, they still buy the farm on the back end at that step down price, and
Mm-hmm.
the money essentially comes back in full and rolls on to the next farm. So you can imagine the revolving fund, the impact over time, it expands over and over again, because every time we go through that model, funds come back and we're on to the next farm. So
Okay.
it's a really powerful model for expanding the impact of this, especially in a geography like this where it's greatly needed.
Okay. Now I've got a few. So I want to get into the program and how it works to benefit new and beginning farmers, but I got a couple questions I want to ask you to preface that.
Sure.
My first question regarding that for the new and the beginning farmer is they enter into this lease with the option to buy. They ultimately end up making the purchase. They plan on farming this ground for a long time, but the land around them that has not been placed into a conservation easement, it continues to sprawl. So at some point, and I guess this depends on where it's at in the time frame, but I'm imagining at some point somebody will find their 40 or 50 or 60 acre farm surrounded by subdivisions, white vinyl fence, stoplights,
Yeah.
right? And it
Yeah.
creates challenges to farming. Now, like where I'm at in Idaho, we have a what we call a right to farm, and it's in our state constitution. So they can't develop around me and say your farm's a nuisance, you can no longer farm. We have that right to farm, and that's an inherited nuisance by the people that choose to move around me. I don't know if Georgia has that or if other states have that or not, but even if they do have that, it still creates major challenges to farming if you've got 300 people that live in a perimeter around you who are constantly complaining about dust, complaining about
Exactly.
odors, complaining about machinery or noise or whatever that may be. What goes on with that farmer if they reach that point where it becomes almost impractical to farm because the sprawl has just enveloped them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we could talk. I think it'd be great. I mean, I guess before we talk about what happens to that in that situation, I will
Uh-huh.
say it's a really important point, and I would say that it's really more relevant to the geography that we have focused on is to avoid that problem. So in Atlanta is a great example. So we're looking at a roughly 35 county geography, although I would say it's more of a donut around Atlanta, right? Like there's certain land that's too expensive, and you may find pockets of small farms that are already in that situation. But it's too late, right? I mean, the land is also just too expensive. We would spend too much money for too little acreage to really make a program like this work. Um, and unfortunately, the die has already been cast there. So I would say we're out. Think another level out from that, where land is still somewhat affordable, but over the long haul, if you take the view that over the next decade and the next couple decades, eventually that same pressure is going to come to those areas. We're trying to get out in front of that. So it's a little bit of a hybrid from what we were talking about earlier. Going to where land is affordable at farmland value is the top line amount today versus development value. So I will say that we're very purposeful about that. But the other thing about it is we are targeting a few key areas, and our goal is not to just get farms scattershot across this 35 county geography. It is actually to focus on clusters of protected farmland because I think there's a lot of power in those networks. Number one, because once you hit a critical mass, we think there's an ability to grow support at the local level for farmland protection beyond our program. Let's be clear, we can't protect every farm that needs to be protected. I wouldn't pretend for a moment we could do that. I wish I had access to that kind of capital. I don't. But we do think we can be a catalyst for getting more support for existing farmers who we talked about earlier. They just need the easement funding, right? They just need the money to keep them doing what they're already doing, protecting and stewarding that land for their next generation. So there's a lot of focus on what are these networks of farms, and beyond that, it also creates this opportunity for coordination around markets, equipment sharing, and sharing. I mean, a lot of these next generation farmers we work with, they don't fit the profile of that farmer who just wants their 100 acres. Don't
Mm-hmm.
mess with me. I don't want to talk to any other farmers. I'm going to go do my thing. They welcome and invite
Mm-hmm.
sharing, knowledge, technical assistance, and things. So we are very focused on networks, and so I'm much more interested in finding those 5 to 10 key geographies where we can create some meaningful clusters of long-term protected farmland that will stay there forever than getting that one farm that is hemmed in on all sides by suburban development. It's very difficult to do that. I've gone out to beautiful farms
Mm-hmm.
within a 30-minute drive of metro Atlanta, and then had them describe what that development over to my right was, and that was the Polo Club. And I was like, yeah, it's it's too late. Like it's
Yeah.
and land is $60,000 an acre, right? I mean, it's
Hmm.
way beyond what would make sense. And so I hope that that farm will find a way to get protection over time. But we are trying to look to seek a different geography than that, if that makes sense.
So you talked about the conservation fund is in support of people who want to have a sustainable agricultural model, which I understand the way we do things on my farm. I'm sure you would consider us sustainable. I'm sure we would fit in, and I do that because we're a small farm, and so we have to market to a niche in order to. I mean, just the margins would be too small if we tried to do things on a commodity basis, and so we have
Mhm.
to market to a niche so we can raise those margins and give ourselves a chance at a profit and all of that. So here's my question for you on that. A lot of people choose their model of farming, sustainable, direct marketing, organic, whatever that may be, based on the price that they can command for whatever it is they're growing or raising or whatever that may be. With your model with supporting sustainable farming, is that built into it? These increased prices for these products, or if we saw a slump in the economy, if we saw the demand for sustainably produced food diminish and therefore the prices drop, would these farmers entering into this model and promising to produce food in this manner, would they see their margins shrink to where it was no longer viable for them?
Yeah, it's a great question and a complex one, I
Yeah.
think, and because it gets very geographically specific too. So I'll try to speak to the Georgia context, although I think it does relate to other places around the country. So a lot of the farmers we're working with, as I mentioned earlier, are committed to sustainable farming practices, and it is either something. It usually is twofold, right? I mean, part of it is tied to their commitment to the land and the ecological protection, environmental outcomes on the property, but markets. I mean,
Yeah.
and in a place like Atlanta, we don't have that many organic, and I'm not just talking about organic, but we don't have that many organic farms, and we don't. It is in high demand, and
Hmm.
so they can command a premium, whether it's selling to a local restaurant or to individuals. That has been a really successful marketing opportunity, sales opportunity for many. And then institutional buyers who are increasingly wanting to do this. And of course, a lot of this is consumer driven, right? I mean, every year, more people and want to know where their food came from and
Hmm.
how it was produced, which I think is a good thing. And often that comes with a commitment to pay more. So we view this as something that we think will be a long term outcome of the
Okay.
program. We're not going to dictate it. This is a lot more about carrots than sticks. Like,
Hmm.
how do we incentivize this over time? I think the best way we can do that is by supporting those farmers once they're on site. So I find a lot of farmers are already doing a lot of those sustainable practices just because, as you mentioned, right, it's the
Right.
best thing to do for the soil, for the land. And but often they're missing existing programs, right? I mean, it could be conservation reserve program, it could be things they're doing on site that they should be getting direct cash payments for or other benefits through existing programs, but they don't have the bandwidth to access those. So we're going to be very proactive in making sure our farmers are aware of those programs, or they get connected to other organizations who spend a lot of time figuring out how to do direct farmer support. So we want to be a resource and a liaison for them to make sure they're getting the benefits that are
Hmm.
out there through existing programs for work that they're already doing in farming sustainably. We also want to give them technical assistance. We have great groups here. Georgia Organics is one that works with a lot of organic farmers. We're lucky that the Rodale Institute just located their Southeast Organic Center here in Georgia for the first time. It opened a few months ago. So we're talking to them about ways they can work with direct technical assistance to our farmers who want to do more sustainable practices with a view towards markets that will help them. But then the key thing really is these partnerships like Emory. So the big incentive for farmers to move to more sustainable practices over time is knowing they're going to get paid more. And
Hmm.
so for with a program like Emory, it's perfect because they have a built-in incentive to be able to sell to them. You have to produce in a certain way, and they're very
Mm-hmm.
explicit about what those requirements are. But in return, you get a long-term contract, you get certainty, and you also get to know like what are their needs, right? I mean, the ability to forecast out in advance and figure out
Mm-hmm.
what their needs are is a huge thing for farmers in our program. So there are no guarantees, right? If we were hugely successful and all of a sudden Georgia was flooded with sustainable organic farming, then maybe you get to a point where prices really come down in a dramatic way, so that
Mm-hmm.
that's not as surefire, a profitable outcome for them in the future. But my feeling is that this demand, especially around large metropolitan areas, is going to continue to grow. And so as long as that demand continues to grow while we try to build up supply, my hope is that we'll see more
Mm-hmm.
institutions and more supply chains committing to this type of more sustainable and more local.
Well, I mean, honestly, I love production ag, but I also I love the, I don't know, what would you call it, the throwback to going back to a day where people went directly to the farm or they
Yeah,
bought directly from. To me,
yeah,
it's part of the reason I love ag is those images
yep.
from the past, and I like to see that developing. Okay, one more question, and then this one will lead right into talking about the partnerships and all of that. But when I've interviewed organizations that match up retiring farmers with new and beginning farmers, the farm transition programs that exist, the International Farm Transition Network, places like that, one thing that's always been consistent is that, like in one instance, I think they had 15 farmers signed up, but like 600 new and beginning farmers who were looking to be matched up. So the ratio was super skewed towards
Yeah.
people who were looking to get into farming. With you and the limited resources that you have there in the Atlanta metro area, how does that skew for you? Is it closer to a 50-50, or do you have a lot more people looking to get into farming than those who are looking to transition and use this conservation easement method to do that?
Yeah, it's interesting. It gets very geographically specific, but I would say so far, I think, and we're just launching and getting this going, but we've been working on that pipeline of farmers and
Mm-hmm.
farms for several years. It has a pretty even match, but that is because there is a lot of potential farmland around metropolitan Atlanta, and
Mm-hmm.
that is it's a little different than other contexts because a lot of farmland here and pasture land is underutilized or unutilized, right? A lot of historic farming. So land and potential farmland is almost unlimited, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a huge supply on that side. That doesn't mean every farm's created equal,
Right.
obviously. And when it comes to turnkey farm operations, those are harder to come by. Um, and then on the farmer side, this is not for brand new farmers. And so I spend a lot of time telling people what this isn't,
Okay.
this is not for a 2 acre farm. This is not for somebody who just, graduated and thinks they want to farm but doesn't have experience. It is for people who have a track record and experience farming, more likely to be somebody who maybe was a farm manager, right? And has
Mm-hmm.
5 or 6 years experience. They know what they're doing. They've always wanted to own their own farm. Could be somebody who's farming on 10 acres in the city or, closer into the city, but is perfectly capable of farming 150 acres and bringing a couple other partners on. I have a
Mm-hmm.
couple of those examples, live examples right now. But I think it's a pretty good balance. I hope that the thing I worry about most here is the pipeline of farmers over time,
Yeah.
right? I'm not so worried about the first 15 farmers, but I'm really worried about how we ensure that there is a long-term commitment from that side of people who want to keep farming like this. And I think we have to create our own success. We have to show this is a viable way to make a living.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good life. People always will choose this life. I don't think anybody's going to pretend that farming is just, you're in it for the money, right? I
No.
mean, but people really do. I mean, it's a lifestyle and people are going to keep making that lifestyle choice. I get that. I grew up,
Mm-hmm.
in a very rural area and, I think what we've got to really think about over the long haul is how do we make sure we've talked a lot about how we're losing farmers and we're losing farmland. But one of the things I get most excited, I mean, I'll get back to something you said just a minute ago. One of the things I'm most excited about is the location of these farms because we're in close proximity to so many schools, so many kids. I mean, there's a lot more being lost than farms
Hmm.
and farmers. We're really losing some knowledge of the land and what it means to farm. And so I view these networks of farms being places in such close proximity to the city that people can drive out and buy their food, but they can also bring their kids out there who get to see the farm and what happens on the farm. It's interesting in the pandemic. This is already happening. I have farmers who've told me one of the farms we were thinking about purchasing, he actually is going to keep farming. It's become he was going from having to drive into the farmers market every Saturday morning at 4 a.m. It turns out that with the pandemic, people recognizing more how important where their food
Hmm.
comes from, the supply chains being broken, all of a sudden the ability to sell online and people coming out to the farm has exploded during the pandemic. And so I think there's this real connection to be made between the urban, rural, and between local food production and a large city like Metro Atlanta. And we're just on the cusp of that. But that gets me really excited because long term, we're going to have a connection to the land again and a
Hmm.
connection to farming and a knowledge of what that means to get more farmers. That's just essential.
Okay. I lied. I've got one more question before we jump
Oh
into
yeah,
the
yeah,
partnership.
yep.
So I talk about on this show all the time people who want to farm. If that's their number one priority, is I want to farm. I want to have my own farm, and I want that lifestyle. I always say they need to be willing to relocate. If you say I want to do it, but I want to do it here around my family, then farming's not your number one priority. And just like you just said, we're not in it for the money. We're in it for the lifestyle, and it's a difficult lifestyle to achieve and then sustain. So you really have to make it your number one priority. So with that in mind, can people who meet the experience requirements that you're talking about, can people from outside of Georgia, could they come and take advantage of this, or is there a residency requirement?
There's no residency requirement, and it's interesting. It's more anecdotal, but since we started working on this program, I've talked to quite a few farmers outside of Georgia who
Hmm.
have said, if this program is in place, I would move tomorrow because of what you said, right? They're
Hmm.
looking for, they want that farm, that land ownership long term, and then of course being able to access markets. So my hope is there'll be a robust pipeline of farmers in Georgia, but I do anticipate that there will be people from outside of Georgia as well, and I think that would be a good thing, especially if these are people who are committed to long term farm ownership and operation in this geography. And again, I think we're building a bridge here because I view this in many ways as it's a patient pathway to land ownership and farm ownership for
Hmm.
people who are already committed to this. But there's also a bit of a bridge here too. I mean, we've found now, I mean, the pandemic has borne this out too, that people are actually choosing because they can work remotely, right,
Hmm.
to move to a place where they have a better quality of life, frankly,
Right.
than living. I live in the middle of the city and I like it, but it's not for everyone. And there are a lot of people who would rather own more land and have a little bit, slower pace of life and get to a place where they can have land in their backyard. This is a way you can do that. You're not that far from the city. We're talking about farms that are within a 2-hour drive. Most of them are within an hour drive
Hmm.
of Atlanta. Now that's all relative. It's Atlanta,
Yeah.
but for the most part though, you could. I mean, and with increasing work flexibility, you could likely have one part of the family working from the farm and another, operating the farm solely. So this is a lot about autonomy for farmers and the
Hmm.
lifestyle they want to choose. And I think it opens up a lot of options because of the proximity to a place like Metro Atlanta, but the ability to really get out and own your own farm.
Okay. All right. So I'm sorry it took me so long to get to it, but I'm just flooded with questions about what you're doing. And I love what you're doing. I love the thought of tying up farmland so it stays farmland as long as there's no taking, which obviously there's not. It's voluntary or it's done based
Yeah.
on fair market value, which is great. Which
Yeah.
is great. Okay, so talk about for the new and beginning farmers that are coming into this program. talk about the way you will partner with them and the way you will support them.
Yep. And this is something I would say as we've been putting this program together, it is one of the things that we've had to spend the most time on, because I don't pretend for a moment. We're a conservation organization. We know
Mm-hmm.
real estate, we know conservation, we know how to get conservation funding, but we're not farming experts. I don't pretend to be. Just because I listen to the Farmer to Farmer podcast, and my wife will tell me, it doesn't mean that I'm a farmer. Um, but but it means we got to partner with key organizations to make this happen over time. So one of the things we do from day one is we're trying to match farmers to sites. So they could come with a farm site. That's great. If not, we're understanding. We have a simple farmer questionnaire that leads into a second step of due diligence of kind of understanding the basics, right? Like, what's your current operation? What's your farming history? What's your experience? What do you want? Where do you want to be? Give us the top three counties, that you're interested in, this geography. Where do you want to be 3 years from now? And then if it looks like it's a good fit, moving into that next step where we actually match them to a site and start talking about a business plan that is matched to that site. And we'll help them work on that business plan. One of the partnerships we're working on is with the University of Georgia, big land grant university here, great
Mm-hmm.
agricultural um, um, uh, background. And so, again, working with their small business center over time, we want to work with them to be able to make sure people get the resources they need to build out a business plan, think about marketing. And then once they're on and then doing an assessment on day one, right? Like, what does this farm need? What infrastructure is missing? Is it turnkey? What do you think you're going to need in year 3, year 5? Starting to build towards the future conservation easement. We work with them from day one on what we anticipate the ultimate purchase price after the easement dollars come in. Really laying out a vision, because we don't want this to be we don't want it to just be like a cozy lease forever scenario, right? And
Mm-hmm.
we want somebody who's committed to the long term ownership of the property, and we also want to be transparent and help them understand realistically how do they get to farm ownership on the back end. So, but once they're matched to a site and entering the program, there are lots of partnerships that come into play. That farmer support side, as I mentioned, connecting them to existing programs, whether it be working with NRCS, Farm Bureau,
Mm-hmm.
um, other nonprofits who do a lot of farmer support work, understanding what their needs are and getting them matched to the resources. Sometimes that might be lining them up with a grant from USDA to do what they want to do on site, get a
Mm-hmm.
hoop house, whatever it might be. That's a huge part of it. I would say the technical assistance, and that could expand to sustainable practices. And then taking a look on the market side, right? Is Emory a good match for them? If not, we might connect them to another farmer in our network who has a restaurant relationship and knows that they have this need. So when we build out that network too, it's going to get stronger and stronger to help those farmers coming in who might have a gap somewhere that other farmers had 2 or 3 years ago and have worked through. So a lot of it is going to be connecting the resources, getting the funding in the door for the easement, and then really working to get them lined up to purchase the property. So one of the things that I'm working on a lot now is who are going to be our key partners, right, on the financing side, like working with the farm credit, with local banks who honestly the ones that understand farms, so that
Mm-hmm.
if our farmer needs a loan for equipment that's critical that we can't handle on the front end, we can get them that. If they need it in year 3, they need to buy a tractor, we can tell them where to go. And then really building the credibility with our program with the lenders who can provide them the loan for the purchase of the farm on the back end, which is really critical, because we want to set them up for success over the long haul. So if we're successful and we get to year 3 or year 5 and they buy the farm, the goal is that they have a successful operation, they have markets, they have some great resources in the farms within their network that they
Mm-hmm.
need. They also have, they may be in the conservation reserve program or other things. And they don't need us anymore, frankly. They have
Mm-hmm.
the relationships with those other organizations and they can always call us up, but we're on to helping that next farm and that next farmer. And they are well established in a place that they can be successful over the long term.
Okay. Wow, this is a lot. And this is going to get a lot of people very excited. Is this happening anywhere else in the U.S., or is the Atlanta metro area kind of the incubator for this?
This is the incubator. There are other buy, protect, sell programs that are very successful, some run by land trusts in different locations, but this is the first of its kind, especially being purposefully anchored around an area where there's huge demand for this local sustainable
Mm-hmm.
food and partnerships like the one we've established with Emory. But we are actively going to be looking for next locations. We have a few thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
on locations, especially where we have people already involved in. And we've done farmland protection all across the country in different ways. But this is the pilot location for the Working Farms Fund program. But we are proactively looking for other places. So welcome, people telling us places like Boise, you'd be
Mm-hmm.
a good match. And here's why, because a lot of it is understanding the partnerships that are there on the ground, the circumstances with development pressure and other things that make a program like this tick. Um, so we are actively seeking other places so that we can scale up here in Georgia, but also expand this over time. So welcome all inquiries and ideas. And I'm getting some great feedback from other areas where people are saying, we're ready for this. We have the farmers, we have the same threats to
Mm-hmm.
farmland and a growing local food movement that is ripe for a program like this.
Okay. Okay, so for people listening who are interested, they want to learn more. Maybe they want to move to the Atlanta metro area. How should they go about contacting you, finding out information? Where should they go?
Yes, so they can actually go to the Conservation Fund's website, to the Working Farms Fund website, and I don't know if there's a place where if it's easier for me to share that or afterwards, but they can contact me directly there.
Okay.
And Christian Varsa is also our Working Farms Fund associate who works with a lot of our prospective farmers and farms. The best step is to reach out directly to us, email, phone. We are happy to talk anytime and would be glad to tell them more about the program.
Okay. And in this day and age of social media, are you guys out there as well?
Yeah, well, we do have a presence mainly through the Conservation Fund on Facebook
Okay.
and Instagram and others. So would be happy to share those as well.
Awesome. Well, man, this has been unbelievably interesting. It's exciting. Is there any burning question that you wanted to answer that I did not ask you that we'd want to get in before we wrap it up?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground. Hopefully, I mean, hopefully, those were the things you were thinking about. And there's so much to talk about in each of
Yeah.
these categories, right? I mean, it's a complex thing, but I'll just say that I'm really excited about it. And the thing that gets me most excited are the farmers that I meet because they really are. They're entrepreneurs. They're connected to the land. They're committed to farming long term. They're committed to protecting the land, which is obviously why we're in this.
Mm-hmm.
And they really are committed to changing our local food system over the long haul. And I think we have to have programs like this that will support farmland protection and land access and these next generation farmers to make that happen over the long haul. So I'm just really excited about the program, and I really appreciate you giving me the time. It's been fun, and I really appreciate it.
Hey, you bet, Stacy. It's been great. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Of course. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you for being here, everybody, and thank you to Stacy Funderburke for coming on today and explaining all about the Conservation Fund and everything they are doing there in the Atlanta metro area. I think is very, very interesting. I think there's a lot of opportunities available, and it'll be interesting to see if this model spreads throughout the rest of the United States. For all of you who don't like seeing sprawl, you don't like seeing development take over farmland, here is a potential solution there. So very interesting. Thank you all for being here. And hey, please click that subscribe button. We'd love to have you as subscribers on our YouTube channel. And of course, we'd love to connect with you on social media everywhere else we're at. LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all of those places. And hey, as always, enjoy your journey to the ultimate lifestyle business, agriculture.